It weighed exactly 3.96 kilograms, which was just under 4 kilograms. Many men would simply round that number up to make it easier to remember, but Billy Singh did not round up. Billy knew the exact weight of this rifle in the same intimate way a man knows the heavy weight of his own dominant hand. He could literally feel the subtle difference between a fully loaded magazine and one that was just a single round short. The weight registered deep in his shoulder and his cheek. This weapon was the short magazine Lee Enfield No. 1 Mark III, chambered for the .303 British cartridge. The barrel measured exactly 635 millimeters in length. Its total overall length from the muzzle tip to the wooden butt plate was 1,130 millimeters. It utilized a 10-round detachable box magazine and featured a reliable bolt-action mechanism. The factory rear sight was precisely graduated up to 2,000 yards. Muzzle velocity reached an impressive 744 meters per second. That specific velocity meant the 174 grain-pointed projectile exited the steel barrel, traveling over 2,000 feet every single second. The internal rifling featured 5 deep grooves with a left-hand twist rate of 1 complete turn every 10 inches. You must remember these cold mathematical figures to understand the machine. Then you must immediately forget them because the rifle that finally arrived on the harsh Gallipoli Peninsula in May of 1915 was no longer defined by these standard factory production specifications or official military manuals. This specific weapon was entirely defined by what it had already accomplished long before it ever saw a military battlefield. It had successfully killed hundreds and perhaps thousands of wild kangaroos across the dry and unyielding red plains of Queensland. The oppressive heat in that desolate region frequently cracked the dry earth wide open. The surrounding silence was so incredibly vast that a hunter could easily hear an animal casually shifting its weight from over 200 meters away. This battered object was clearly not a standardized military weapon yet. It was merely a harsh agricultural tool meant solely for brutal pest control. It was a functional working instrument carried constantly by a tired working man traversing a demanding landscape. The wooden stock was crafted from heavy walnut timber. That walnut surface was profoundly worn down from countless hours of extreme physical exposure. The original protective factory oil finish had long since been entirely replaced by a thick, accumulated residue of dried human sweat and fine red dust. Constant daily handling slowly alters the very chemical nature of the timber. This transformation happens when a heavy rifle is picked up and set down 10,000 times across a grueling decade of continuous outdoor labor. The factory checkering texture on the wooden pistol grip was worn completely smooth. The specific places where his calloused right hand naturally closed tightly around the heavy wood were highly polished by endless friction to a dull, reflective sheen. The forgotten places where his rough fingers rarely touched still rigidly held onto the sharp, original factory texture. One side felt incredibly rough, while the other resembled smooth glass. That distinct physical wear pattern is exactly what 10 brutal years of commercial kangaroo shooting ultimately does to dense walnut wood. It personalizes a lethal weapon far more precisely than any expensive factory customization process ever could. The sturdy stock had literally molded its external surface to match the exact physical geometry of one specific human body. The wooden comb rested against his jaw at exactly the perfect height where his dominant eye naturally aligned with the rudimentary iron sights without requiring any additional conscious adjustment or physical shifting whatsoever. Tiny muscular corrections always cost a shooter a critical fraction of a second and inevitably introduce a fatal degree of error into the trajectory. He never had to consciously search for his proper sight picture because the sight picture always naturally found him instead. The heavy rifle had been organically shaped over countless years of daily repetition into a flawless physical extension of the solitary man who carried it. The man wielding this particular machine weighed a modest 64 kilograms, and his legal name was William Edward Singh. Billy was born during the early days of March in the year 1886 in a small, dusty settlement called Claremont. It was an isolated mining and cattle town located deep in the central highlands of Queensland. This rugged territory required exceptional toughness from its inhabitants because the nearest neighbor might be an entire hour away by horseback. If a man suffered a serious medical injury out there, reaching a trained doctor would usually take a full day of desperate travel under an agonizingly hot sun. His father was an immigrant driver named John Singh who had journeyed to Australia from Shanghai during the chaotic gold rush era and simply decided to remain when the gold veins inevitably dried up. His mother was an English nurse named Mary Ann Pugh who had traveled far from her comfortable home in Staffordshire. He was therefore the mixed child of a Chinese father and an English mother, trying to survive during the rigid era of the White Australia policy. You must firmly grasp the dark reality of that social environment. The brutal Immigration Restriction Act of 1901 was the strict law of the land, which loudly legislated the national desire to remain exclusively European in demographic composition. Here was a quiet boy carrying a distinct Chinese surname, alongside facial features that immediately marked him as an unwelcome outsider in his own birth country. He diligently learned how to shoot animals with deadly precision long before he fully realized that the harsh country he was learning to shoot in did not actually want him to exist there at all. This depressing social isolation significantly matters because the supreme marksmanship that would eventually make him the deadliest combat sniper at Gallipoli was definitely not a product of formal military training. His profound lethal skills were never carefully taught by a screaming army instructor holding a printed doctrinal manual on a manicured grassy shooting range. His relentless methodology was forged strictly in the suffocating red dust and the dead brown grass while staring through the dizzying mirages of central Queensland heat waves just to put necessary daily food onto his family table. Collecting small government bounty payments for rural pest control was a brutally difficult physical occupation. Wild kangaroos naturally traveled in large observant mobs across the expansive terrain. These animals were incredibly fast and possessed an acute sensory awareness of their surroundings. They could easily detect clumsy human movement at tremendous distances that generally made an ordinary armed man falsely assume he was entirely invisible. The startled mob would suddenly bolt away into the horizon, leaving the frustrated hunter standing alone, clutching a completely useless rifle while cursing the oppressive hot wind. He eventually realized those nervous animals had actually spotted him 3 entire minutes ago and had merely been patiently waiting to accurately decide whether his distant presence constituted a genuine mortal threat. Shooting elusive kangaroos professionally taught a poor man profound absolute patience. It demanded a physical stillness that completely defied natural human biological urges to constantly twitch or scratch. It strictly taught the unforgiving financial discipline of silently waiting for the perfect guaranteed shot rather than eagerly forcing a marginal one that would only waste precious imported ammunition. Every single brass cartridge he chambered cost hard-earned money, and every tragic miss represented a direct net financial loss to his impoverished household. A commercial hunter who foolishly wasted valuable ammunition did not manage to remain a commercial hunter for very long in that bleak economy. He ruthlessly learned to make every single round count because his family income quite literally depended upon the precise mathematical intersection of a speeding bullet and a distant skull. The heavy rifle violently taught him that singular, unyielding lesson every single miserable afternoon. This mechanical relationship is never an emotional or remotely sentimental bond found in cheap fictional adventure novels. It is, instead, a deeply neurological partnership forged through the brutal repetition of thousands of identical physical actions. The repetitive sequence of smoothly raising the heavy stock to his shoulder and finding the front sight post became entirely autonomic. These deliberate hunting actions firmly migrated outward from his conscious active thought straight down into his deepest primitive muscle memory. Billy eventually stopped actively thinking about the complex mechanics of aiming and shooting altogether. He simply did not need to consciously think about pulling a stiff metal trigger any more than a normal walking man actively thinks about forcefully placing one boot in front of another. The worn weapon had truly become an integral component of his internal biological operating system. When the catastrophic global war suddenly broke out in the late summer months of 1914, Billy immediately enlisted as a willing trooper in the 5th Australian Light Horse Regiment. The examining medical officer casually noted his exceptionally slight physical build on paperwork. That tired doctor completely ignored his obvious Chinese heritage because the desperately expanding imperial military urgently needed capable men who could ride horses and accurately shoot rifles. The strict racial restrictions magically faded away when the distant empire required fresh blood to spill. Billy brought those deeply ingrained hunting skills with him across the ocean on the crowded transport ships. The rifle was merely a cold mechanical delivery system meant to transport his terrifying operational mindset directly into the absolute worst killing fields the entire world had ever seen. His regiment proudly sailed away toward Egypt during the freezing month of December in 1914 to commence difficult combat training. They spent endless, miserable weeks practicing tactical maneuvers in the vast, unforgiving desert sands while hopelessly waiting for direct deployment orders. The restless young troopers deeply chafed under the strict military discipline and the terrible, stagnant boredom of their isolated desert encampment. They eagerly desired to finally test their vaunted frontier toughness against a genuine human enemy instead of merely battling the blowing sand and sweltering daily heat. Their beloved horses ultimately stayed firmly behind in the dusty Egyptian camps when the excited regiment finally departed for the front lines. The senior Allied command had officially determined that the incredibly steep peninsula terrain was completely unsuitable for traditional mounted cavalry operations. The proud men of the 5th Regiment were thus suddenly transformed into common marching infantrymen carrying heavy packs. They were stripped of their fast animals, but they strictly retained their well-maintained personal rifles, which represented their absolute final remaining tether to their previous civilian lives back home. Billy Singh calmly stepped off the landing boat onto the blood-soaked beaches of Gallipoli during the middle of May. He arrived precisely 3 horrific weeks after the disastrous initial Allied amphibious landings had already tragically failed to achieve any meaningful strategic breakthroughs. The overarching tactical situation on the jagged beachhead was already entirely catastrophic for the trapped invading forces. The frightened infantrymen were permanently pinned down beneath imposing cliffs while facing a highly disciplined Ottoman defense force that securely controlled every single piece of elevated high ground. This incredibly dangerous vertical environment immediately negated any traditional concepts of open infantry warfare that military commanders had foolishly planned to execute. The frustrated Australians found themselves ruthlessly packed into shallow, muddy trenches where sudden death arrived daily without any prior warning whatsoever. Enemy snipers operated with total impunity from the secure scrub-covered ridges overlooking the vulnerable Allied positions below. Billy slowly surveyed this dreadful vertical slaughterhouse and quickly realized his lonely civilian profession as a patient hunter was exactly what this grim situation desperately demanded right now. The physical reality of the Gallipoli Peninsula immediately crushed any romantic notions of glorious imperial warfare. The Australian forces were brutally pinned within a tiny perimeter that measured barely 1,000 meters deep from the water to the farthest trench. The terrain consisted of sheer sandstone cliffs and dense thorny ravines that violently funneled men into predictable killing zones. The defending Ottoman army securely held all the crucial elevated ridges overlooking the narrow beachhead. They systematically poured heavy plunging fire down onto the trapped invaders with devastating geometric precision every single day. The suffocating proximity of the opposing trench lines generated an atmosphere of constant psychological terror. At the notorious location known as Quinn's Post, the hostile defensive earthworks were separated by a terrifying distance of less than 30 meters. That is roughly the standard length of a municipal swimming pool. The frontline soldiers could clearly hear the enemy troops coughing, talking, and preparing their daily meals. This claustrophobic geometry meant that traditional artillery support was frequently impossible without inflicting severe friendly casualties upon their own forward defensive positions. Highly skilled Turkish marksmen methodically occupied the scrub-covered hillsides and fortified ridgelines overlooking the desperate Australian perimeter. They calmly fired down into the vulnerable, shallow trenches with the chilling patience of local men who intimately knew exactly where their frightened targets must eventually appear. The unforgiving terrain was organically constructed for long-range sniping operations. It was incredibly rocky, deeply broken, and heavily covered in low, deceptive vegetation that offered excellent natural concealment to anyone who properly understood how to exploit the harsh environment. Any exhausted soldier who carelessly raised his unprotected head above the fragile sandbag parapet for more than 3 brief seconds was literally gambling with his own life. An infantryman who foolishly attempted to sprint across a tiny patch of open ground was placing a desperate bet he would rarely survive to collect. The terrifying sound of a high-velocity sniper bullet became their constant psychological companion. There was simply the sharp supersonic crack of the passing round, immediately followed by the wet, sickening thud of the terminal ballistic impact. There was rarely any dramatic, cinematic screaming when a man was suddenly struck by one of these invisible projectiles. Sometimes a weary soldier merely folded onto himself like an empty canvas sack and heavily dropped straight down into the muddy trench water. The surviving men standing directly beside him frequently did not immediately comprehend what had just occurred because they had not even heard the distant muzzle blast that actually killed him. Into this localized geometric slaughterhouse proudly stepped a quiet man holding a worn wooden rifle. The unmounted troopers of the 5th Light Horse Regiment were quickly allocated a defensive sector surrounding an elevated position that would eventually become designated as Chatham's Post. This specific area was strategically named to honor a young cavalry officer who served there. This elevated location provided excellent tactical observation lanes directly across the complex Ottoman trench networks. It crucially offered Billy Singh something far more important than mere elevation. It provided a strangely familiar operational canvas that a professional rural kangaroo shooter instantly recognized and deeply understood. He slowly scanned the distant hostile ridges and critically processed the scattered gray rocks and the stubborn low vegetation clinging to the dry soil. He closely observed the thick, shimmering heat haze violently rising directly off the sun-baked earth and distorting the visual landscape. He mentally calculated the incredibly long sight lines that continuously changed depending upon the shifting angle of the afternoon sun. This awful place was definitely not a dense tropical jungle or a dark European forest. It was an open, semi-arid environment with highly limited cover. This harsh, foreign geography was fundamentally identical in its physical character to the merciless dry plains located directly west of Clermont. That was the exact same environment where Billy had already spent an entire decade painstakingly learning how to spot things that desperately did not want to be spotted. The enemy soldiers believed they were perfectly hidden among the distant gray shadows. They incorrectly assumed that their rudimentary camouflage techniques made them entirely invisible to the frightened invaders nervously huddled down in the filthy valleys below them. Billy coldly realized that these armed men were ultimately just another dangerous mob of prey moving across a predictable landscape. He quietly began constructing his very first dedicated sniper hide before the morning sun could rise and expose his physical movements. He methodically arranged heavy sandbags and jagged loose stones to create a small, reinforced firing aperture. He carefully wove dry native scrub and dead thorny branches deeply into the visible gaps to flawlessly break up the unnatural, straight geometric lines of his artificial defensive position. He deliberately settled the heavy wooden stock of his rifle firmly across the stable firing rest while ensuring the steel barrel remained completely shadowed from the revealing sunlight. He silently settled his small frame into the rough dirt and began the agonizing process of waiting. Beside him sat a designated military spotter holding a powerful brass telescope whose sole crucial job was to continuously scan the complex Ottoman trench system for viable targets. The Turkish defenders were naturally cautious because they had already learned that any careless movement was instantly fatal. They had cleverly constructed tiny protective loopholes deep within their defensive dirt parapets. These were incredibly narrow structural gaps through which they could safely observe the battlefield and fire their weapons without violently exposing their fragile skulls to incoming return fire. They always moved rapidly while crossing any open sections of their connecting communication trenches. They instinctively kept their dark heads pinned low to the ground whenever possible. But these enemies were ultimately biological humans, and tired biological humans inevitably make fatal physical mistakes under prolonged psychological duress. A sweaty head unconsciously rises upward for exactly 1 second too long while stretching a cramped neck muscle. A dirty bare hand briefly appears above the timber wall to reposition a rotting sandbag that is slowly collapsing. An exhausted sentry carelessly stands up straight to relieve his aching spine after enduring 3 hours of forced, cramped immobility. For 2 or perhaps 3 fleeting seconds, he becomes distinctly visible above the protective dirt trench line. 2 seconds is an absolute eternity for a man who shoots moving targets for a living. The heavy rifle rested motionless on the sandbag, weighing precisely 3.96 kilograms. The well-worn wooden comb pushed familiarly against his cheek exactly where it belonged. Billy stared intensely through the rudimentary iron sights and completely ignored the chaotic noise of the surrounding artillery barrages. He smoothly pressed the metal trigger straight to the rear without anticipating the violent recoil. A heavy lead bullet instantly crossed the empty geometric space separating the 2 trenches. The distant head suddenly vanished and the spotter calmly recorded the kill. Billy established a relentless daily routine that completely defied the chaotic unpredictability of standard trench warfare. He arose every single morning in the pitch-black darkness long before the rising sun could illuminate the shattered landscape. He crawled silently through the muddy communication trenches to reach his carefully prepared firing position while the rest of the exhausted garrison desperately tried to sleep. He knew that occupying the sniper hide during daylight hours would instantly reveal his precise location to the observant Turkish sentries currently watching the opposing ridgelines. He settled his slight body into the cramped dirt hole and meticulously arranged his camouflage netting before the first gray light breached the eastern horizon. Beside him sat Trooper Ion Idrius, who functioned as his primary spotter and trusted operational partner. Idrius wielded a powerful optical telescope that allowed him to meticulously scan the distant enemy defensive works for any subtle signs of human movement. They operated together as a singular lethal organism, combining the extreme magnification of the brass telescope with the precise mechanical delivery of the worn wooden rifle. The punishing environmental conditions on the unforgiving peninsula were frequently far more dangerous than the constant enemy artillery bombardments. The midday ambient temperatures regularly climbed well past 40 degrees Celsius and remained oppressively trapped within the stagnant air of the deep trenches. The glaring sun violently baked the surrounding sandstone ridges until the entire rocky landscape radiated intense physical heat like an industrial masonry oven. The unfortunate men trapped inside the infantry trenches desperately stripped off their heavy woolen uniform tunics and hopelessly prayed for a fleeting coastal afternoon breeze. Ordinary frontline soldiers could casually lean against the reinforced dirt walls to stretch their cramping leg muscles or simply roll their aching shoulders to relieve physical tension. A dedicated combat sniper possessed absolutely none of those basic biological luxuries during a prolonged daytime deployment. Any sudden physical movement immediately equaled visual detection by the vigilant enemy marksmen scanning the Australian lines. Visual detection instantly equaled sudden violent death from a high-velocity rifle bullet. Billy was strictly forced to remain completely motionless for agonizingly long hours at a single stretch. The heavy steel barrel of his trusted weapon absorbed the relentless solar radiation until the exposed metal became entirely too hot to touch with unprotected bare skin. Sustained daily firing sequences rapidly pushed those internal barrel temperatures to a dangerous level that would instantly raise a severe fluid blister on a careless hand. He purposefully wrapped a filthy, torn cloth tightly around his right hand, just to manipulate the burning steel bolt handle without suffering debilitating superficial burns. The dense walnut stock absorbed this intense heat much more slowly. By the brutal peak of the sweltering afternoon, the entire wooden weapon radiated uncomfortable warmth directly against his sweating cheek like a flat stone pulled from a dying campfire. He held that blistering machine firmly against his face while ignoring the stinging, salty sweat pouring into his stinging eyes. The only biological components of his entire body that were physically permitted to move were his shifting dark eyes and his calloused right index finger resting lightly upon the curved metal trigger. Absolute physical stillness was his ultimate defensive armor. Idrius watched through his magnified brass telescope one afternoon as Billy coldly worked a targeted section of the elevated Turkish defensive trench. A careless enemy head suddenly appeared above the dirt parapet and Billy immediately fired a single round. The target instantly vanished below the protective earthwork. A second curious head appeared 30 meters down the same trench line, desperately peering over the sandbags to see what had just happened to the first soldier. Billy smoothly worked the bolt action, and the second targeted head disappeared in a spray of dust. A third desperate man bravely rose above the defensive parapet carrying a heavy wooden stretcher pole while frantically trying to recover his bleeding wounded comrades. Billy kept his finger resting firmly against the hot metal trigger, but he deliberately did not fire his weapon. He coldly permitted the vulnerable stretcher bearer to conduct his grim medical work without facing any lethal interruption. He maintained his rigid sight picture and simply waited for the inevitable tactical progression to unfold exactly as his rural hunting experience dictated it eventually must happen. The unarmed stretcher bearer finally departed the immediate kill zone, carrying a bleeding casualty back toward the rear medical stations. A fourth Turkish soldier cautiously appeared in the exact same location, but this specific man was carrying a loaded infantry rifle and aggressively scanning the Australian lines for the hidden sniper. Billy instantly pressed the stiff metal trigger and the heavy recoil punched his shoulder. The fourth hostile head completely disappeared from the spotter's optical view. He had efficiently traded 3 precise bullets for 3 confirmed enemy combatants. He possessed the incredible optical acuity of a hunting hawk combined with the terrifying patience of a feral cat diligently watching a small mouse hole. The tactical principle remained exactly the same across all 3 drastically different landscapes of his life. The hunter must always silently wait and continuously watch the surrounding environment without moving a single muscle until the targeted prey finally commits to a fatal physical mistake. When that specific target inevitably commits, the hunter must absolutely never miss because the frightened target will not commit twice. The frightened Turkish infantrymen rapidly learned that casual carelessness above the defensive trench line was guaranteed sudden death. They defensively retreated behind their reinforced dirt parapets and desperately attempted to exclusively utilize their tiny prepared loopholes for external battlefield observation. These narrow gaps measured only a few bare centimeters across and were carefully designed to provide maximum ballistic protection while allowing minimal visual access. Firing a heavy lead bullet directly through such a microscopic dark opening from several hundred meters away required an incredibly profound level of mechanical mastery. Billy mathematically analyzed the protective loopholes and continuously fired his high-velocity rounds directly into the tiny dark apertures. He systematically learned to read the complex patterns of human movement deep within the fortified Turkish trenches exactly the way he had once read the grazing behavior of nervous kangaroo mobs. He instinctively noted exactly where the enemy soldiers gathered for daily meals and carefully cataloged which specific communication routes they utilized at different hours of the blistering day. He constructed a flawless mental map of the opposing trench architecture. The grim official kill count steadily mounted over the dragging summer months. He routinely secured 1 confirmed kill a day and then 2 and sometimes achieved as many as 9 dead men on highly exceptional afternoons. Each individual successful strike was strictly verified through the powerful brass telescope before being formally recorded in the official military ledger. This brutal accounting process was never based upon hopeful guesswork or exaggerated personal estimations meant to boost sagging unit morale. Idris visually confirmed the kinetic physical strike and recorded the dropping body. The staggering number of dead enemy soldiers grew so rapidly that it was actively passed along the crowded Australian defensive lines mouth to mouth, exactly like a running cricket score. This dark humor represented the perfect psychological analogy for an exhausted army of working-class Australians who inherently understood competitive cricket the same way they understood biological breathing. The filthy soldiers huddled in the muddy dugouts would continuously ask each other how many points Singh had managed to secure today. The morbid unit respect for his silent work was absolutely total. The official regimental documentation formally recorded 119 perfectly verified and completely documented enemy kills by the early days of September. This specific numerical achievement represented approximately 3 exhausting months of constant continuous sniping operations under the worst environmental conditions imaginable. The grim actual number of dead Ottoman infantrymen was undoubtedly significantly higher because those documented figures only strictly included the specific fatal shots directly observed by an assigned military spotter. The formal regimental records completely ignored any unobserved tactical engagements or questionable peripheral hits. The strict mathematical tally completely failed to include the numerous fatal shots Billy fired when his designated military spotter was temporarily absent or medically indisposed. It systematically excluded the numerous distant targets that were definitively struck by flying lead but could not be absolutely confirmed as immediately dead rather than severely wounded and bleeding out. Major Stephen Midgley closely served alongside the quiet sniper and professionally estimated the genuine operational tally was mathematically much closer to 300 total casualties. 300 dead men manufactured by one single worn rifle. The relentless daily application of this intimate localized violence required a uniquely cold psychological detachment that very few ordinary soldiers could ever successfully maintain. Every single trigger press was a deliberate moral commitment to instantly extinguish a specific human life, staring back through the wavering heat distortion. He was not blindly firing artillery shells into a faceless advancing crowd or suppressing an invisible grid square with a heavy machine gun. Every single 174 grain bullet represented an intense, microscopic conversation ending in absolute sudden darkness. The distinct auditory signature of his trusted weapon firing was not the sharp, cracking snap associated with modern high-velocity precision rifles. The heavy .303 cartridge pushed a massive lead bullet at a moderate tactical velocity that produced a significantly deeper and fuller acoustic bark. The resulting muzzle report carried a brutal acoustic weight and a distinct physical body that thinner modern rounds simply do not possess. The heavy recoil firmly pushed straight back into his bruised right shoulder instead of delivering a violent upward mechanical kick. The bolt-action mechanism was incredibly smooth, but Billy absolutely never utilized the famous rapid-fire techniques taught to British line infantrymen. He deliberately fired a single aimed round and then patiently waited in absolute silence while observing the resulting tactical chaos. Sometimes he allowed 5 quiet minutes to pass between targeted shots, and sometimes he waited an entire hour without moving a single muscle. Each heavy brass cartridge carefully chambered was a calculated tactical decision meant to maximize enemy psychological terror while strictly minimizing his own physical exposure. The overpowering physical smell of the wooden rifle after a long day of sustained combat firing consisted of burnt cordite and hot steel mixed heavily with human sweat. The constant salty sweat pouring from his calloused hands and his unwashed cheek continuously pressed directly against the wooden stock. It was the exact same dense organic smell that had been deeply soaking into the heavy walnut timber during his entire previous civilian life. The worn wood greedily absorbed the horrific war just as it had previously absorbed the harsh Australian outback. The frustrated Ottoman military command eventually realized they were rapidly losing an entire platoon of valuable infantrymen to a single invisible ghost occupying the opposing ridgeline. They desperately studied the grim clustering pattern of their daily casualties and slowly mapped the estimated ballistic trajectories originating from the general vicinity of Chatham's Post. They understood they could never defeat this specific hidden menace with random artillery bombardments or blind machine gun suppression. They required a surgical instrument to effectively counter this lethal mechanical attrition, slowly bleeding their defending army dry. The Ottoman command summoned a dedicated specialist to eliminate this specific threat. The Australians simply named him Abdul the Terrible, though his genuine identity remains entirely lost to military history. He was a highly decorated marksman previously recognized by the Sultan himself for exceptional precision shooting. This deployment was not a standard defensive rotation, but a highly targeted assassination mission meant solely to kill the invisible Australian ghost and completely stop the relentless daily bleeding. Abdul operated with cold, methodical precision, while closely examining the shattered skulls of the recent Turkish casualties to calculate the exact ballistic trajectories. He mathematically studied the complex defensive angles and logically traced the invisible paths of the high-velocity projectiles backward across the deadly geometric space. He possessed a profound professional understanding of natural concealment and the uncompromising physics dictating long-range engagements. He possessed the rare technical skills required to actually locate Billy Singh hiding among the scattered rocks. Billy instinctively felt this shifting tactical dynamic and immediately recognized that another apex predator was currently observing the exact same contested terrain. The lethal dynamic of the cat patiently watching the mouse hole suddenly transformed because there were now 2 cats. This intense psychological duel slowly unfolded over several agonizing days of absolute physical stillness under the punishing August sun. Neither dedicated marksman kept a detailed written calendar of their daily movements, because they strictly maintained detailed mental kill counts instead. What remains absolutely certain is that the skilled Ottoman specialist managed to get incredibly close to achieving his singular objective. Abdul meticulously stalked the Australian positions and successfully identified a tiny visual anomaly within the reinforced sandbag parapet surrounding Chatham's Post. He carefully calculated the exact distance and calmly adjusted his rifle sights to execute the perfect shot. A single heavy bullet violently fired from the distant Turkish ridgeline flawlessly found the camouflaged Australian sniper position. This high-velocity projectile instantly smashed straight through the thick glass lenses of Trooper Tom Sheehan's brass spotting telescope. The spinning lead bullet violently exited the metal optical tube and tore directly through the spotter's hands and shattered his jaw before finally burying itself deep into Billy's right shoulder. You must carefully follow the terrifying physical sequence of that single flawless shot. One single bullet perfectly defeated the optical equipment and simultaneously struck two hidden men inside a fortified bunker. The incoming metal round precisely entered an optical viewing tube measuring perhaps 4 bare centimeters in total diameter. It forcefully exited through the bleeding biological mass of the unfortunate man, holding it before violently striking the primary target, resting directly beside him. The distant Ottoman shooter who coldly executed that shot was firing at an optical target he could barely even perceive through a microscopic gap in the Australian camouflage netting. That was absolutely not blind luck, but rather the terrifying mechanical consistency of a world-class military marksman operating at the absolute peak of his lethal craft. Sheehan was immediately pulled backward into the muddy trench floor while bleeding profusely from his horrific facial wounds and shattered hands. He was rapidly evacuated from the bloody frontline trenches and quickly placed upon a hospital ship sailing back toward Australia. His personal war was permanently finished due to a single fraction of a second. Billy suffered a painful kinetic impact that damaged his shoulder tissue, but the ballistic strike miraculously failed to shatter any crucial bones or sever major arteries. The medical orderlies quickly bandaged his bleeding shoulder and strictly ordered him to rest in the dugouts. He completely ignored the medical advice and stubbornly returned directly to his elevated sniping position within a single week. 7 short days after catching a high-velocity bullet in his firing shoulder, he was quietly sitting back on the dangerous front line. His trusted wooden rifle remained completely undamaged by the sudden, violent exchange. The heavy machine still weighed exactly 3.96 kilograms, and the worn walnut stock still rested perfectly against his bruised cheek. The stiff metal trigger pull remained entirely known by pure biological instinct. Everything remained exactly the same, except the hunter was now hunted. The psychological pressure of knowing a superior enemy marksman actively knows your general location would easily break the fragile nerves of an ordinary infantryman. Billy completely absorbed this terrifying new reality without displaying any visible emotional reaction or altering his methodical daily routine. He simply returned to the harsh dirt hide and resumed staring through the wavering heat mirages with increased optical intensity. The deadly tactical equation had been completely simplified down to its purest mathematical essence. Whoever made the very first microscopic physical mistake in the blistering heat would immediately absorb a heavy lead bullet traveling at supersonic speed. The historical sources describing the final violent conclusion between these two men differ slightly regarding the exact sequence of events. The core mechanical reality of the lethal encounter remains entirely consistent across all reliable military accounts. Billy successfully identified the hidden Turkish position by utilizing the exact same visual techniques he had always used in the dusty Queensland outback. He patiently watched the shimmering terrain for countless hours until he noticed the subtle physical thing that absolutely did not belong there. He merely waited for the flawless Ottoman professional to eventually commit a single tragic human error. He spotted a dark, artificial shadow that subtly moved when the hot afternoon wind was completely still. He noticed a slight color variation that did not perfectly match the natural gray rock formation sitting directly behind it. He perhaps caught the faintest microscopic glint of harsh sunlight reflecting off a glass lens or an exposed steel bolt handle. It was the tiny, unavoidable mistake that a tired man inevitably makes when he falsely believes he remains perfectly hidden from his prey. Abdul temporarily forgot that the hidden Australian ghost possessed a decade of brutal visual training. Billy had spent endless months making himself entirely invisible on this exact same patch of broken ground, and he knew exactly what tiny visual anomalies to hunt for. He slowly shifted the heavy wooden stock directly into his wounded right shoulder while strictly ignoring the sharp stabbing pain radiating through his torn muscle tissue. He found his perfect sight picture and smoothly pressed the metal trigger straight to the rear without a single moment of emotional hesitation. The heavy rifle violently barked, and the distant visual anomaly immediately collapsed into the dusty earth forever. Abdul the Terrible was dead. The resulting Turkish tactical response to the sudden death of their premier marksman was both immediate and furiously destructive. The Ottoman command completely abandoned precision rifle fire and immediately ordered a massive, concentrated artillery barrage directly onto the suspected Australian firing position. Heavy explosive shells violently obliterated the entire specific area surrounding the camouflage hide. The reinforced sandbags and heavy gray rocks and dry, thorny scrub were instantly reduced to a chaotic, smoking crater of pulverized dust. The explosive shock waves violently shook the deep trenches and rained massive amounts of heavy debris down upon the frightened infantrymen below. The heavy artillery barrage ultimately achieved absolutely nothing because Billy Singh was no longer physically occupying that shattered location. He had coldly squeezed the trigger to kill his opponent and immediately evacuated the firing position without waiting to admire his grim handiwork. This represents the absolute oldest tactical rule governing professional sniping operations. It was a strict survival rule he had never been formally taught by military instructors because nobody had ever needed to teach him. You must always shoot and immediately move because the dead target inevitably has angry friends holding heavy explosive ordnance. The skilled Turkish specialist was permanently buried beneath the dusty soil of the Gallipoli Peninsula alongside thousands of other unfortunate men. The worn wooden rifle that abruptly ended his life weighed exactly 3.96 kilograms and fired a 174-grain bullet at a moderate velocity. It was merely a mass-produced mechanical instrument originally designed to generically arm the vast line infantry regiments of the British Empire. But this specific machine had been ruthlessly educated in the blistering hot kangaroo paddocks of central Queensland and had heavily favored the Australian. The Gallipoli, the grim official military tally of confirmed Ottoman casualties, simply continued its steady, relentless climb upward after the violent duel concluded. By late October of 1915, the commanding officer of the entire Army Corps formally issued an official military order specifically complimenting Trooper Singh. General William Birdwood publicly recognized the quiet Australian marksman for successfully accounting for exactly 201 confirmed enemy kills. The senior general was obviously quite willing to officially credit a significantly higher numerical total than the conservative regimental records, which still stubbornly sat around 150 documented bodies. An entry from the official battlefield diary perfectly captured the grim operational mood with incredibly understated military precision. The typed report stated their premier regimental sniper had successfully accounted for his 199th targeted enemy combatant yesterday afternoon. It strictly noted that every single one of these recorded kills was absolutely vouched for by an independent military observer who frequently happened to be a commissioned officer looking through a magnified optical telescope. This was entirely verified mechanical slaughter, mathematically documented in real time by highly trained military professionals rather than exaggerated trench mythology. Most modern readers incorrectly assume that a combat sniper of this incredible lethal caliber must have heavily utilized an advanced telescopic sight. There is indeed some historical evidence suggesting certain civilian rifle club members brought their own personal weapons fitted with expensive target optics. However, the most reliable historical accounts consistently describe Billy utilizing the standard military rifle equipped solely with its basic factory iron sights. These featured a simple blade front sight and a notched rear sight graduated for long distances. These were the exact same rudimentary sights he had utilized for a decade in Australia. These basic mechanical sights were the specific instruments through which he had previously learned to perfectly read windage and heat mirage. Through 10 long years of constant brutal repetition, those crude metal sights had become entirely transparent to his highly trained visual cortex. He no longer actively looked directly at them, but rather looked completely past them toward the distant target. The required sight picture had become entirely automatic and instinctive. Utilizing iron sights was never a severe mechanical limitation for this specific operator, but rather a deliberate tactical preference allowing maximum situational awareness of the battlefield. A magnified telescopic sight inherently narrows a shooter's field of visual perception and forcefully restricts their situational awareness to one specific focal point. Standard iron sights allow a trained operator to maintain critical peripheral awareness of the broader surrounding environment, while still focusing upon the intended target. For a lonely man who was actively hunting other armed men who continuously moved and fired back across a chaotic landscape, this peripheral awareness was absolutely critical. Maintaining a wide field of view was not a tactical luxury, but rather the fundamental biological key to his continued daily physical survival. By late December of 1915, the massive Allied military evacuation of the Gallipoli Peninsula finally commenced under the protective cover of winter darkness. This complex withdrawal paradoxically represented the singular most successful tactical operation of the entire disastrous Mediterranean campaign. Tens of thousands of exhausted infantrymen silently evacuated from the contested beaches without suffering a single combat casualty. The worn rifles were among the absolute last physical items to leave the bloody trenches. Billy Singh quietly departed the shattered peninsula, carrying his heavy wooden weapon and a grim, lethal reputation that the wider world was just beginning to fully understand. He transferred to the 31st Infantry Battalion and immediately sailed toward the freezing mud of the European Western Front. The brutal industrial war violently tearing across France and Belgium was a fundamentally different combat environment than the arid Mediterranean ridges. The operational distances between opposing trench lines were vastly greater, and the devastating heavy artillery bombardments were infinitely more destructive. The critical tactical role of the individual precision sniper was severely diminished by the terrifying industrial scale of the mechanized slaughter. Men were violently erased by massive explosive shells long before they ever saw an enemy rifleman. Billy possessed a highly specific operational genius that relied upon close-range intimacy and personalized mechanical precision. Those unique hunting skills that had made him absolutely lethal among the rocky gullies of Gallipoli were sadly far less suited to the sprawling mechanized meat grinder of the European theater. The heavy wooden rifle faithfully traveled with him into the freezing mud of Flanders. It still weighed exactly 3.96 kilograms and possessed the exact same smooth trigger pull. But the surrounding war had violently changed, and the worn machine simply could not dynamically evolve to effectively match it. He dutifully served at Polygon Wood in Belgium during the bloody autumn of 1917, where he actively led aggressive anti-sniper fighting patrols. He was formally mentioned in military dispatches again, and was officially awarded the Belgian Croix de Guerre for extreme personal gallantry. But his fragile physical body was steadily failing under the immense environmental strain. He was severely wounded by explosive shrapnel and permanently damaged by exposure to toxic chemical gas clouds. The lingering chemical damage to his lungs strictly dictated his permanent medical discharge as entirely unfit for any further frontline combat service. Billy finally returned to Australia aboard a crowded troop transport ship during the summer of 1918. He arrived back in his dusty home state of Queensland to a massive public hero's welcome featuring marching brass bands and formal political speeches. The grateful local citizens publicly presented him with a heavy purse of gold sovereigns. He had legally married a Scottish woman named Elizabeth while recovering from his severe combat wounds in Edinburgh. The historical military records remain entirely contradictory regarding whether she actually ever followed her traumatized new husband back to the sweltering isolation of the Australian outback. What remains absolutely clear to historical observers is the grim, tragic trajectory of what predictably happened next. The absolute deadliest combat sniper of the entire Gallipoli campaign simply returned to ordinary civilian life and rapidly discovered a harsh economic reality. Peacetime capitalist society possessed absolutely no financial use or practical employment for a damaged man whose singular greatest worldly skill was accurately putting high-velocity bullets into human skulls from 300 meters away. The profound operational patience and the absolute emotional detachment that had previously transformed him into a celebrated national hero were entirely worthless in the civilian economy. He quietly traveled back toward the familiar dusty plains of Claremont, and stubbornly attempted to work a miserable mining claim on the exhausted Michael goldfield. The raw gold was incredibly sparse and the financial rewards were practically non-existent. His brief Scottish marriage quickly disintegrated under the crushing weight of profound poverty and geographic isolation. The intense global fame that had briefly made his Chinese surname famous across an entire empire steadily faded away into absolute obscurity. The celebrated shadow warrior slowly transformed into just another broken, aging man, known only to a rapidly shrinking circle of impoverished neighbors. He desperately tried attempting back-breaking sheep farming and later pursued several other worthless mining claims, but absolutely nothing permanent ever materialized for him. The immense physiological damage from the toxic European gas attacks constantly ravaged his compromised respiratory system. In the dark year of 1942, with another massive global war completely consuming the terrified world, Billy finally abandoned the rural outback forever. He quietly packed his meager physical possessions and traveled straight toward the crowded coastal city of Brisbane. He desperately informed his surviving sister that it might prove slightly cheaper to simply exist in the urban slums. He forcefully took a miserable physical laboring job, despite his failing lungs and his advancing chronological age. He was currently 56 years old, and his battered biological frame carried the terrible accumulated damage of toxic gas and 30 brutal years of hard rural living. On the 19th day of May in 1943, William Edward Singh suddenly died completely alone inside his rented room at a cheap urban boarding house. The attending medical coroner officially recorded the mundane cause of death as a massive ruptured aorta. The legendary ghost of Gallipoli was exactly 57 years old. The official legal inventory of his significant personal possessions at the exact time of his lonely death represented a profound national disgrace. His entire worldly estate consisted solely of a dilapidated wooden hut situated on a worthless mining claim valued at perhaps £20. His only liquid financial assets totaled the incredibly pathetic sum of exactly 5 silver shillings. The lethal biological machine, who had definitively proven worth far more to the imperial war effort than an entire battery of heavy field artillery, literally owned just 5 basic shillings when his tired heart finally exploded in the dark. His prestigious military combat medals were entirely gone from his tiny rented room. They were likely pawned or desperately sold for basic food at some undocumented point during his long, tragic decades of quiet civilian decline. The legendary worn wooden rifle that had fundamentally altered the deadly tactical dynamics of the Ottoman trenches was completely missing from his pathetic final inventory. Its specific, ultimate historical fate remains completely unrecorded in any official government archive. The heavy mechanical instrument may have been unceremoniously returned to a dusty military supply depot immediately following his medical discharge from the Imperial Armed Forces. That specific rifle might be quietly sitting inside a glass museum case, completely unrecognized by oblivious passing tourists. Its terrifying, lethal history remains totally invisible to anyone who does not intimately understand what the deep physical wear pattern on the wooden stock actually signifies. The checkering on the wooden grip remains perfectly smooth on one side and rigidly sharp on the other. It was ultimately just 3.96 kilograms of dense walnut timber and cold-forged steel that briefly intersected with the brutal trajectory of global history. If you ever find it, you will know it immediately.